The scariest thing about anxiety is that it feels like it can strike at any time. One moment we're feeling fine, the next we're suddenly feeling really anxious, and it feels like that just came out of nowhere. Your stomach is suddenly tight, your breathing is shallow, your mind is hazy and you can't concentrate, and you're just filled with this sense that things are not going to be okay. And usually this happens at really inconvenient times, like when you're at work or when you're at social events. So it's often difficult to even find the space or the time to go and calm yourself down, and you might have to just suppress it and try and get on with your day. All of that is very scary, and it makes sense why we're afraid of that and why we're worried that this horrible experience could just pop up out of nowhere for no reason and ruin our day. But why does it seem to come out of nowhere? Why do we feel anxious for seemingly no reason? Well, the answer is there is a reason. It's just not what we've been told. Despite how annoying and self-sabotaging your mind can be, it never does anything without a reason. And that's a good thing, because if there's a reason, then it means you can do something about it. And so the problem we have to overcome is, why does it feel like there isn't a reason? And how can we find out what that actual reason really is? The explanation most of us are given for why we feel anxious for no reason is that we have an anxiety disorder. Now, that's a useful label, but it doesn't actually tell us anything about how to solve our problem. Sometimes we're told that we have anxiety because of some trauma that happened in our past, and that this trauma is why we still feel anxious in the present. And this is more helpful, but it still doesn't tell us why that trauma happened or what we can do about it in the present to make ourselves feel better. Instead, we're often given medication to suppress our symptoms and then sent to therapy to learn coping strategies to try and make us feel better right now. And this can help. Medication and coping strategies are very effective and very useful, especially if you want to go from sheer panic to establishing some kind of workable and livable baseline in your life. But these methods don't get to the root of the issue, which means that no matter how much medication we take or whatever coping strategies we learn, we're still going to feel like, oh, I'm suddenly anxious for no reason. So what is the root cause behind feeling anxious for no reason? Well, I'm going to break it down for you all the way from the surface level trigger right down to the very heart of the issue. And then I'll tell you what you can do about it so that you can start cultivating your own self-awareness to be able to identify and feel through your own issues. And so you can start cultivating the skills necessary to start managing your own anxiety and healing your own anxiety. So let's get into it. As I said, your mind never does anything without a reason. The reason why you feel anxious for no reason is because the trigger that has made you feel anxious is tucked away in your subconscious, and the actual fear is locked away deep down inside your unconscious. Now, that's a lot of psychology jargon, so let me put it really simply. The thing that made you feel anxious is just slightly outside of your awareness. And the real thing that's actually making you feel anxious is deep down, and it's kind of been poked by this thing that's popped into your awareness. And that's why the anxiety seems to come out of nowhere, because both the trigger for it and the actual root of it are both exist outside of our usual conscious awareness. So here's how you can become aware of all of that. Let's start with the trigger. When your anxiety seems to come out of nowhere, this means that the trigger is stuck in your subconscious, meaning it is just outside of your regular awareness and you need to actively try and think about it to bring it into your conscious awareness. This trigger could be anything and it will be unique to you, but there are some pretty common themes like stresses at work, fighting with partners or other important relationships, catastrophes on the news, negative or positive news from a family member or a friend, health problems, not getting enough sleep, Basically anything that can make you kind of feel off balance emotionally. The reason these triggers can be so difficult to spot is because we often don't think they're important enough or big enough to justify the huge level of anxiety that we're feeling. And we're right, because our anxiety is not about the thing that we feel like has caused it. It's not about the trigger. The trigger is just what sparks it off. And we need to follow that spark all the way down to really get to the root cause. And so the first step to dealing with and figuring out why you feel anxious for no reason is to recognize your triggers. I'd recommend creating a list of the moments that you feel anxious throughout a week or even just a couple of days, and then writing down how you feel and why you think you're anxious. Just write down the first thing that comes to mind. It doesn't have to be the right reason. To do this, it can often be helpful to, once you've caught yourself and gone, oh, look, I'm feeling anxious, speak that out loud. You can say, I'm feeling anxious. I wonder why I'm feeling anxious. And then say the first thing that comes up. By doing this, you allow the trigger to come through and bypass all of the rationalizations that make you think it's not serious enough or important enough or big enough. And it just allows you to say what's actually triggered you into feeling anxious. As I said, don't worry about trying to be right. If you do this for a couple of days and then write down what you see, if you reflect upon that, you'll start noticing patterns, and there is truth in those patterns. I want to touch on one trigger specifically that we anxious people can really suffer from, and that is feeling anxious about being anxious. It's that fear that I mentioned at the start of the video about anxiety suddenly coming up and making you feel bad and ruining your day. It is totally valid to feel worried about your anxiety and how that might impact your life, especially if you have a history where that has been the case. And it's also unhelpful when we trigger ourselves into being anxious by worrying that we could become anxious. So what can you do about that? And if it was just as simple as, oh look, I'm anxious about being anxious, then we wouldn't be anxious anymore. Well, in the short term, having that noticing and that awareness can be really beneficial because it can help us go, I'm anxiously ruminating. Okay, I'm going to choose not to do that. And then we go and distract ourselves with anything else. This is called mindfulness, and it's really helpful because by spotting the pattern and choosing to do something different, we break the pattern, and that retrains our mind into more healthier ways that we want to think. But even then, this is usually a coping mechanism that can help us think in ways that are more productive. What we really need to do is get down to the root issue of what's causing our anxiety. So let's go to this root cause. The root cause behind your anxiety is the fear of losing control. Think about it. Triggers make you feel like you're losing control over your life. A fight with your partner makes you feel, oh gosh, they might leave me and I really don't want that, but you are not in control of how they act and if they did choose to leave. A work deadline makes you worried that you might fail and be embarrassed, but again, you can prepare all you want, but you're not in control of the outcome of the presentation or how other people receive it. Even your fear of being anxious is a fear of losing control, because when you feel so anxious that you can't act or think in ways that you would like, you are not in control. But there's an even deeper part to this. There's an even deeper layer. Because why is it so bad that your partner might leave you, or that you might be embarrassed at work, or even get fired, or that you might become anxious and act in ways that you don't really want to act? There's no universal law saying that any of those things are inherently bad. We just selfishly believe and cling to them because they're good for our survival. The answer is that if any of those things happened, you would feel shame. The fear of being out of control is really a fear of feeling shame. Our fear of feeling shame is why we feel anxious for no reason. Shame hurts. When we were growing up, Our parents, our carers, our teachers used shame to make us behave in ways that they needed us to behave. Some of this was helpful. There is such a thing as healthy shame. Healthy shame stops you from running down the street naked or trying to pick a fight with a grizzly bear. But a lot of the shame that was used on us as children was unhealthy shame, otherwise known as toxic shame. Where healthy shame tells us that an action we took was bad, toxic shame says that we are bad. We are bad for existing. We are bad for wanting the things that we want and for doing the things we naturally feel compelled to do. Toxic shame makes us feel like we don't have a right to exist. And there is nothing more painful than feeling like you shouldn't exist. But this is what happened to us when we expressed certain parts of ourselves when we were children, and those parts weren't allowed. With anxiety, this is often our angry parts. Maybe when we were 2 years old, we were praised for being a good boy and for doing what mummy and daddy say we should do. But when we weren't happy, and when we didn't want to do what mummy and daddy said, well, then we were bad and naughty and disobedient and ungrateful. Maybe even in some cases we were hit or put in timeout and abandoned and left alone. Young children don't have the capacity to understand why they're being hit, why they're being yelled at, why they've been left in this room all alone. All they experience is some giant shouting at them, and then suddenly they're alone and they're upset and they don't know where nice mummy and daddy have gone. Young children don't have a differentiated sense of self, meaning they are unable to see themselves as separate to the outside world. So if mummy is angry, the child can't think, maybe this is an issue with my mother and doesn't have anything to do with me. No, the child thinks, mummy is angry, it's my fault, I am bad. And that feeling of I am bad, that toxic shame, is the worst feeling that we can ever feel. And of course, the child doesn't want to feel that again. And it can't leave its parents. So instead, it leaves that part of itself. It decides never to show that part of itself, never to do that behavior ever again. Because to do so would be to risk feeling that shame, and that is too painful. And this is a highly effective survival strategy. Remember I said that the mind never does anything without a reason. It's extremely effective for a 2-year-old who has a mother that can't hold his anger to cut himself off from his anger. However, when that little boy grows up and becomes a man, he'll find that he's unable to stand up for himself and that he, for some strange reason, just feels anxious all the time. The strategy he used at 2 years old to survive and keep himself safe is still being used within him even as an adult. It has remained inside him to protect him from feeling that shame, and it is so deep down in his unconscious that he's not even aware that that is happening. And so that old strategy keeps working to protect him, even though he's a grown-ass man and he no longer relies on his mother for his survival. This means that when something happens that he, as a grown-up, has every capability of dealing with, like a work deadline or a fight with his partner, he suddenly starts feeling anxious. And he might not even know why, because these triggers don't seem to be serious enough to justify the levels of anxiety that he is feeling. He starts to wonder, why do I feel anxious for no reason? I hope that makes a bit more sense now. You are never feeling anxious for no reason. Your anxiety is caused by a fear of losing control, which is really a fear of feeling shame. But that shame doesn't exist in the present moment except as an idea in your mind. You think that you're worried about some shame happening in the future, but really you're worried about re-experiencing the shame that you experienced in the past. And can you see how neither of those experiences is actually real? They do not exist right now when you're feeling anxious. They're just your imagination and a memory. And that's not to say that your feelings aren't valid. It's very valid to feel anxious about feeling shame. But your feelings are probably not appropriate to the situation that is facing you today, because those feelings don't belong to this situation. They're not actually caused by what's happening today. You're not a child anymore. You're an adult. And you're not in that toxically shaming situation anymore. You're free to choose your own life, and you're more than capable of dealing with anything that might come your way. So the next time you're feeling anxious for no reason, look around you and ask yourself, is it happening right now? And you'll see that your worst fear only exists in your mind. As the philosopher from the School of Life, Alain de Botton, says, the thing we fear the most has already happened to us. So that's my take on why we feel anxious for seemingly no reason. Look out for a part 2 of this video where I'll go through an experience of my own and take you through this in a bit more depth. Comment below some of your strategies for how you deal with anxiety and toxic shame. Please hit like and subscribe if you'd like to see more content like this. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon.